The first night in the old house was surprisingly quiet. The place smelled of damp wood and old paint, but Rachel and Mark were too exhausted to care. After weeks of house hunting, packing and paperwork, they'd finally found something they could afford. A dusty, neglected Victorian on the edge of town. Rachel had fallen in love with the high ceilings and antique charm, while Mark had only cared about the price tag. Their son, Ethan, was 6, and the move had been hard on him. He'd cried for days about leaving his friends behind, but by nightfall he was fast asleep, snuggled beneath his dinosaur comforter in his new room. Rachel woke just after midnight. At first, she couldn't figure out what had disturbed her. The room was pitch dark except for a sliver of moonlight cutting across the floor. Then she heard it, a faint tapping like someone drumming their fingers on a table. She held her breath and listened. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the wall behind the headboard. Rachel's heart quickened. She reached over and shook Mark's shoulder. "Mark, do you hear that?" she whispered. Mark groaned and turned over. "Probably just the pipes settling," he muttered, half asleep. Rachel wanted to believe him. She lay back down, pulling the covers to her chin. But the tapping didn't stop. It continued all night, soft and persistent. The next morning, Rachel mentioned it at breakfast. "It was like scratching," she said, pouring milk over Ethan's cereal. "I thought maybe it was mice or something." Mark shrugged. "Old house, Rach. These places always have noises. I'll check it out later." Ethan poked at his cereal. "I heard it too, Mommy," he said, "like nails on the wall." Rachel froze. "You did?" Ethan nodded. "It was scary." Mark sighed and put down his coffee. "All right, I'll grab some traps today. Maybe it's just a rat. They love these old places." That evening, Mark went to the hardware store and came back with traps and some patching supplies. Rachel felt a little better. Maybe it was just rodents. But that night, the sounds came back. Only this time, they were louder. Rachel had just drifted off to sleep when the noise started. Tap, scrape, tap, scrape. It was as if someone or something was clawing at the wall, trying to get out. Sat up, her breath catching in her throat. She could hear it moving, shifting from one end of the wall to the other. "Mark!" she hissed, shoving his shoulder. "Wake up! Listen to that!" Mark rolled over, bleary-eyed, and listened. Scrape.
"Scrape! Scrape!" he frowned. "Damn, that's not mice." The sound stopped as abruptly as it had started.
The silence was even more unsettling. The next morning, Mark called a local handyman named George, an older man who'd worked on dozens of these old houses. George arrived after lunch, wearing faded overalls and a suspicious expression. "Where?"
"Exactly did you hear it?" George asked, rapping his knuckles on the wall. "Right here," Rachel said, pointing to the wall behind the headboard. George pressed his ear to the plaster. He muttered. "Doesn't sound hollow. Could
"Be an old vent or something. Maybe an animal got in." He marked the spot with a pencil and got to work with a crowbar. Rachel watched as he pried the wooden panel loose, revealing the dusty skeleton of the wall. George paused, his face pale. "Oh, God!" he whispered. Rachel stepped closer. "What is it?" George turned, eyes wide with horror. He pointed inside, the wall cavity. On the back of the wooden panel, dozens of deep, ragged scratches ran in frantic, overlapping lines, as if someone, no, something, had clawed at the wood, desperate to get out, and embedded in the scratches were long, dirty fingernails, some cracked, some broken off entirely,
as if they'd been ripped from human hands. Rachel's scream caught in her throat. She staggered back, colliding with the nightstand. Mark rushed in, took one look, and turned pale. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. George shook his head.
"I've seen rats. I've seen raccoons, but I've never seen anything like this." Rachel's voice trembled. "Mark, what's in our walls?" No one spoke. Only the echo of the question remained, hanging in the air like a curse. Outside, the sun had vanished behind dark, rolling clouds. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window pane, and from deep within the house came the sound again. Tap, tap, tap. Rachel felt a cold dread settle over her. Whatever was in the walls, it wasn't just a mouse, and it wasn't done yet. Rachel couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the old house made her jump. Even the wind brushing the trees outside felt sinister. Mark had tried to calm her. "It's probably just some old construction or a raccoon's nest," he'd said. But his eyes had betrayed him. He'd seen the fingernails too, and the scratches that looked too deliberate, too human to be the work of an animal.
Midnight, the sound returned. Tap, tap, scrape. It felt closer this time, like it was just inches away.
Rachel pressed her hand to the wall and felt an icy chill seep through her palm. "Mommy?" Rachel turned. Ethan stood in the doorway, clutching his worn teddy bear, eyes wide with fear. "It's in my room now," he whispered. "It's talking."
To me? Rachel's heart lurched. She hurried over, gathering him in her arms. "What do you mean, baby? Who's talking to you?" Ethan buried his face in her shoulder.
"The lady in the wall. She wants me to help her get out." Rachel's skin prickled. "No, sweetie, there's no one in the wall. You must have had a bad dream." Ethan shook his head violently. "No, Mommy. She said she's trapped. She said she's cold and lonely. She's scratching and scratching so I'll hear her." Mark appeared behind them, his expression grim. "Rach," he said quietly, "we need to get help. This is too much." Rachel nodded, her throat tight. "I'll
"Call Father Leonard tomorrow," she whispered.
He's the one who helped the Hendersons when their house had that problem." Mark didn't argue. He just stared at the wall, his jaw clenched. The next morning, Rachel made the call. Father Leonard was an older priest, known for being practical about things like this. He believed that most hauntings were the product of stress or old wiring, but he always came, just in case. He arrived that afternoon, carrying a worn leather Bible and a small brass crucifix. His eyes were kind, but serious. "Show me where you heard the noises," he said, and Rachel led him through the creaking hallways to the bedroom wall. Father Leonard pressed his ear against the plaster, listening intently. "I do hear something," he said finally. "Like scratching." Rachel's stomach turned. "We found fingernails," she whispered. "Human fingernails." The priest's face paled. "Human?" he repeated, voice hushed. "My child, this house may have a darker
history than you realize."
He asked if he could bless the house, and Rachel eagerly agreed. He moved room to room, sprinkling holy water, murmuring prayers. When he reached Ethan's room, he paused. "Did you talk to her?" he asked Ethan gently. Ethan clutched his teddy bear tighter. "She said she's cold. She wants me to help her." Father Leonard's brows knitted together. "Did she tell you her name?" Ethan shook his head. "She just said help me, over and over." Father Leonard sighed. "Spirits trapped like this are often the victims of violent deaths or unresolved pain," he said to Rachel. "Sometimes they cling to places where they suffered. Sometimes they try to reach the living for help. or revenge. Rachel's mouth went dry. "What do we do?" Father Leonard's gaze was somber. "We need to know what happened here, who she was. Otherwise we can't help her or protect you." That evening, Mark began researching the house's history. He sat, hunched over his laptop at the kitchen table while Rachel made dinner, the tension thick in the air. "Rach," he called finally, voice low. "You need to see this." Rachel dried her hands and walked over. Mark turned the screen to her. It was an old newspaper article from 1954. "Young woman disappears in tragic accident. Local authorities baffled." Rachel read on, her pulse quickening. Margaret Tillman, 19, vanished from her home on Willow Creek Road. Neighbors reported hearing screams and scratching noises the night she disappeared. The house has stood vacant since her disappearance. Rachel stared at the screen. "Willow Creek Road," she whispered. "That's this house." Mark nodded, his jaw tense. She never left. At that moment, a crash echoed from Ethan's room. They both jumped. Rachel dropped the dish towel and bolted up the stairs, Mark close behind. The door to Ethan's room was ajar. Inside, the air felt colder than the rest of the house. Ethan was kneeling by the wall, his small hand pressed against. "The plaster. She's crying, Mommy," he said softly. "She's so sad," Rachel shivered. "Ethan, come away from there." But before she could reach him, a violent bang rattled the wall. A hairline crack snaked across the paint, spreading like a spiderweb. Ethan yelped and jumped back. Mark pulled him into his arms. The crack widened, revealing something dark beneath the plaster, something that pulsed and writhed like a living thing. Rachel's scream caught in her throat. Whatever was inside that wall, it wanted out. Rachel felt like she was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. The crack in Ethan's wall had grown wider overnight, and now it stretched nearly from floor to ceiling. Whatever was inside, Margaret, or the thing that had become of her, was clawing at the boundaries of the house, hungry for release. Father Leonard had promised to return, but when Rachel called the rectory that morning, she learned that he'd been found dead in his car on the side of the road, clutching his Bible, eyes frozen open in horror. The coroner said it looked like a heart attack, but Rachel knew better. Something had followed him. Something from the walls. Mark insisted they pack their things and leave, but Rachel couldn't bear to leave Ethan behind. He'd refused to leave his room, staring at the wall as if hypnotized. She'd tried everything, reasoning, bribing, even shouting, but Ethan just pressed his hand against the crack and whispered things only he and that thing could hear. That evening, as the wind rattled the eaves and the sun dipped behind the trees, Rachel sat on Ethan's bed, holding his cold little hand. "Honey," she said softly, "we have to leave. Please, Daddy's already loading the car." Ethan shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on the wall. "She's almost here, Mommy. She's almost free." Rachel's heart seized. "No! Ethan, you don't understand. She's not your friend. She's dangerous." A soft tapping answered from the wall. Tap, tap, tap. Rachel's blood ran cold. "Mark!" she screamed. Mark burst into the room, eyes wild. "We have to go now!" But Ethan was standing, his tiny hand outstretched toward the wall. "She's coming," he whispered. The crack split open with a groan of tortured wood and plaster. Darkness poured from the wound in the wall, inky blackness that seemed to breathe and twist with a life of its own. Rachel screamed and lunged for Ethan, but the darkness moved faster. It wrapped around his legs, climbing up his body like grasping hands. "Ethan!" Mark roared, grabbing his son's shoulders, but the darkness yanked Ethan backward, dragging him toward the gaping maw in the wall. Rachel lunged too, clawing at the blackness, but it was like grabbing smoke. Her fingers passed right through. Ethan's eyes met hers, wide and terrified.
"Mommy, help me!" And then he was gone. The darkness sucked him into the wall and slammed shut with a deafening crack. The house seemed to exhale a low, rattling sigh of satisfaction. Rachel collapsed to the floor, her screams echoing through.
The house. Mark fell beside her, pounding his fists against the wall until his hands bled. "Give him back," he shouted. "You give him back." But the wall stayed silent. A moment later, the air in the room shifted, cold, heavy. A soft voice floated from behind the plaster, so faint Rachel almost missed it. "Help me." It was Ethan's voice. Rachel's head snapped up. "Ethan! Ethan, baby! Is that you?" "Help me, Mommy," the voice whispered. "She's hurting me." Mark stared at Rachel, eyes wide with horror. "It's a trick," he breathed. "It's
"That thing, it's not him!" But Rachel's mother's heart refused to believe that. "We have to save him," she sobbed.
"We can't leave him in there." Mark grabbed her shoulders. "Rachel, listen to me. If we try to open that wall, whatever's in there will come out. We can't fight it." Rachel trembled. She wanted to believe him, but the voice, Ethan's voice, still called to her from the darkness. "Mommy." Rachel wrenched herself free from Mark's grasp and grabbed the crowbar George had left behind. With shaking hands, she jammed it into the crack and pried. The wall gave way with a groan, revealing a yawning darkness inside, a black void that seemed to pulse with an unnatural life. A cold wind poured from the hole, carrying the smell of decay and old earth. Shadows twisted, forming shapes that almost looked human. Almost. And then she saw Ethan's face, pale and terrified, reaching toward her from the darkness. "Help me, Mommy!" he cried. Rachel screamed and reached for him, but as her fingers brushed his, the darkness lunged, sharp, like a knife of ice in her chest. She gasped and stumbled back, clutching at her heart. Mark pulled her away from the hole just as the darkness coalesced into a shape, a woman, gaunt and twisted, her face a mask of agony. Margaret. Her eyes glowed with a hungry, inhuman light. Her mouth stretched into a smile too wide for any human face. "Thank you," she hissed.
"You've set me free!" She lunged forward, and the darkness swallowed the room. Rachel felt herself falling, screaming as the world vanished in blackness. Rachel hit the ground hard, pain shooting up her arms as she tried to catch herself.
But there was no floor, only an endless, suffocating blackness that seemed to have swallowed the entire house. Mark's voice echoed somewhere in the darkness, faint and desperate.
"Rachel! Where are you?" She tried to answer, but choked on the cold, heavy air. Shadows shifted around her like living things, brushing against her skin, whispering in voices that didn't sound human. "Help me, Mommy." The voice was so
close now. Ethan's voice, trembling and scared. Rachel spun around and saw him, his small form, floating in the darkness, eyes wide with fear. "Ethan!" she screamed, reaching out, but just as her fingers grazed his, a shape moved behind him. Margaret. Her twisted face leered in the darkness, her grin splitting impossibly wide. She reached for Ethan with long, skeletal fingers, her nails black
and cracked. "No!" Rachel shrieked. She lunged at Margaret, but the woman's eyes flared with a blinding, inhuman light. Rachel felt herself paralyzed, pinned by that gaze, every nerve in her body on fire. "You gave me what I wanted," Margaret hissed, her voice like 1,000 wasps buzzing in her ears. "You opened the door."
Now you can join me." Rachel's mouth opened in a silent scream as the darkness closed in, filling her lungs, wrapping around her heart. She felt herself pulled deeper, past the walls, past the house, into something
ancient and hungry. Through the blackness, she saw flashes of memories. Margaret's memories, a young woman locked in a hidden room, scratching and crying for help, betrayed, murdered, buried alive in the walls. But then the memories twisted. Margaret's
face changed, becoming monstrous, her eyes glowing with hatred and hunger. She'd become something else in the dark, a parasite feeding on the living. Rachel fought, clawed, screamed, but it was no use. The darkness was everywhere. Suddenly she felt Mark's hand on hers, a warm, living hand. His voice, rough and
desperate, cut through the noise. "Rachel, fight it for Ethan, for us!" His voice anchored her, gave her a tiny spark of hope. She clung to it, focused on it, and found the strength to resist. With a final scream, she tore herself free of Margaret's
grasp, pulling Ethan with her. The darkness shrieked in rage as they tumbled backward, through the crack in the wall, into the cold air of Ethan's bedroom. Rachel gasped, tears streaming down her face, as Mark wrapped his arms around her and Ethan. The room was bathed in the pale morning light. The wall behind them was whole again, no crack, no darkness, just old plaster. Margaret's voice was gone. Ethan clutched his teddy bear, his eyes red and frightened, but alive. "Mommy," he whispered. "Is she gone?" Rachel pressed a trembling kiss to his forehead. "She's gone, baby. She can't hurt us anymore." Mark held them both, his voice rough with tears. "We're getting out of this house today." They left everything behind. The house on Willow Creek Road stood silent as they drove away. But sometimes, on cold, still nights, neighbors claimed they could hear faint scratching in the walls, like fingernails clawing to get out. And sometimes, if you listened closely, you could almost hear a child's voice calling for help.